Welcome to the Global News Podcast on YouTube, where we go behind the headlines to find out more about a story and why it matters. In today's episode, we're looking at a corruption scandal which is rocking the Ukrainian government and which has implicated allies of President Zelensky. I'm Janat Jalil, and joining me from the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv, is our diplomatic correspondent, James Landale. And James, tell us about this scandal, which has now led to the suspension of Ukraine's justice minister.
Yeah, that's right. It is a substantive corruption scandal, and it's one that goes to the heart of this government. At its core is the allegation that senior ministers and officials and others were involved in a scheme that essentially took kickbacks from contracts that had been agreed to build fortifications and other defensive measures to try and protect the country's energy power plants, primarily the nuclear power plants, from Russian attack. So in other words, substantial infrastructure contracts. And the allegation is that in return for the granting of those contracts, various members of the government were taking kickbacks from the contractors. In all, prosecutors say, alleging around $100 million worth of cash taken out of the Ukrainian government system as a result of this corruption scandal. So it's pretty sizable.
And this suspension of the justice minister, after dozens of raids this week by the anti-corruption agency in Ukraine, which has seen the publication of photos of bags of dollar and euro notes.
Yeah, no, it's been quite unusual. I'm not sure I've ever seen prosecutors announce their work quite this way. You know, they've had videos announcing what they're doing. They have released tapes of some of the evidence they have got, providing transcripts of telephone conversations between some of those ministers and officials that they claim provides evidence of their guilt. They've, as you say, provided photographs of some of the hard cash that they say has been involved in this. In other words, it wasn't just, discrete money transfers. This was actual cash in bags being handed from one person to another. They revealed that a lot of the participants of this alleged scandal had nicknames for each other, code names. One of them was called Che Guevara, another was called Rocket, another was called Carlson, after a famous Ukrainian cartoon character. So it's been quite colourful.
Colourful and shocking. What's the reaction been in Ukraine to this, given that so many people there are suffering lengthy blackouts because of the Russian missile and drone attacks on energy plants?
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of anger, certainly on social media and from politicians beginning to give voice to that as well. Simply because, as you say, Ukraine is going through a hard time at the moment. The Russians are deliberately targeting Ukrainian energy, not just the power stations, but also the transmission networks, particularly in the east. And a lot of people say to me that what Russia's trying to do is basically cut off eastern Ukraine from energy, so that part of the economy goes black. People are living in the colds. They can't buy a bakery in the morning for their breakfast because the bakery ovens aren't working. They can't go to work because their office doesn't have any power. And in that context, if you have these allegations that senior members of the government are taking kickbacks and creaming off government funds for contracts that are designed to protect the creation of energy in this country, that is something that has an incredibly toxic potential in terms of government trust, which is why I think the government is acting at the moment, or desperately trying to give the impression at the moment that it is acting swiftly and effectively by, as you say, suspending the justice minister and others who are being prosecuted as a result of these allegations.
What do you think the impact of this has been on President Zelensky himself, given that earlier this year the Ukrainian authorities tried to bring the anti-corruption agencies under the president's control?
I think this is going to be a real test for President Zelensky, because as you say, earlier this year there was this attempt by the government to take some of the powers away from the anti-corruption prosecutors. That was considered shocking by many people here. It caused a lot of concern, I can tell you, amongst allied governments who support Ukraine, who just said that we think this is the wrong thing to do. And it provoked demonstrations out here on the streets of Kyiv and elsewhere. The government did backtrack. And that since then, people have, if you talk to ministers about it, they say, look, that it showed, a mistake was made, a correction happened. That's what happens in normal governments. But it meant that there was a certain caution, I think, amongst many of the electorate here in Ukraine, just keeping an eye on precisely what's going on. Now, the optimistic view today says what's happened demonstrates that what President Zelensky has done is working. That democracy is turned, the wheel of democracy is turning. People who are accused of corruption have been accused of that, and there'll be a legal judicial process now. Others say, actually, what this shows is that corruption is still pretty endemic in this administration, and the fact that one of the key characters who has been accused of this corruption is somebody who is incredibly close to President Zelensky, Timur mentioned, who is somebody who is the co-owner of the production company that made President Zelensky's television shows before he became a politician, when he was a comedian. This is a man at the heart of these allegations. He, we understand, has fled the country. So this comes very close to President Zelensky. And that's why he's put out a statement saying very explicitly, this is justifying why the Justice Minister has left his post, saying this is a matter of trust. If there are accusations, they must be answered. The decision to remove them from office is prompt and the fastest. So in other words, President Zelensky is trying to send a message to people here that he's acting.
And he's also trying to send a message to international allies in the West at a time when Ukraine is asking for billions of dollars to support it in its war against Russia.
Yeah, this is absolutely crucial. I mean, on one hand, Ukraine is under a lot of pressure from its European allies in particular to crack down on corruption. It's a very specific part of Ukraine's attempt to join the European Union. Last week, there was a report by the European Union giving a sort of an annual assessment, an annual stocktake of Ukraine's passage towards EU membership. And it was pretty positive, except for corruption. It said that the language there was pretty tough in saying that Ukraine had to do more, and there was a risk of it backsliding and had to take decisive action. I think, as I say, people will say, this scandal shows that Ukraine is acting. But I think there will be concern amongst some allies that there is a potential that this damages investment in Ukraine. That some people out there might think, hang on a minute, am I going to invest in this country while it's at war and while corruption hasn't been tackled? Because they're not going to give lots of cash if they think it's going to be creamed off by government officials.
Thanks, James. And you can hear more of that interview and many more stories on the Global News podcast. Just listen wherever you download your podcasts. And if you like this episode, please subscribe to us here on YouTube. And if you'd like us to cover any other story, please leave a comment in the comments section.